My name is Sarah, and I grew up on my family's farm, where tranquility was always a constant. That night I was home alone, a responsibility that didn't worry me since I knew every inch of the property. With my family away for the night, I relished the peace and quiet. It had been a long but productive day, and now, sitting in the living room with a hot cup of tea, I enjoyed the kind of silence only a night on the farm could offer. The house, built by my grandparents, was large and filled with memories. The wooden walls and antique furniture gave me a sense of security, as if time stood still within. The soft wind outside, mixed with the distant chirping of crickets, was familiar and comforting. After a warm bath, I wrapped myself in a blanket on the couch, determined to read a bit before going to bed. Everything was perfectly peaceful, and I had no idea that tranquility would be so abruptly shattered. As the clock ticked slowly forward, I could already feel sleep creeping in. I decided it was time to call it a night, so I went to turn off the lights in the house, making sure everything was in order before heading upstairs. The darkness outside didn't frighten me. On the contrary, it gave me a sense of protection, as if the night hid the farm from the outside world. I locked the front door, a habit that was more about routine than necessity. The farm's safety was something we could always count on. Before heading to my room, I stopped at the living room window and looked out at the moonlit field. The silver glow on the cornfields created an almost magical sight, and I allowed myself a moment of contemplation, taking a deep breath of the fresh night air. There was no sign of life beyond mine in that vastness. It was hard to believe that anything could disturb that peace. Finally, I turned off the last light and climbed the stairs, ready for a peaceful night's sleep. I lay in bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, feeling warmth spread through my body. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I closed my eyes, letting the silence of the farm lull me to sleep. Everything was calm and peaceful, and there was no reason to think that this night would be any different from the countless others I had spent there. Little did I know that in just a few hours, my peace would be shattered in a way I could never have imagined. I woke up suddenly, not understanding why. It took me a few seconds to realize there was a repetitive sound breaking the house's silence, knocking at the front door. Loud and insistent, the kind of sound that couldn't be ignored. My heart started to race as I tried to process what was happening. I looked at the clock beside the bed. It was past midnight. Who could be knocking at the door at this hour? I got out of bed, trying to control the growing fear. The house was plunged into darkness, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I walked to the bedroom window and peeked through the curtain, trying to see who was out there. What I saw made me hold my breath for a moment. A man, completely drenched from the rain, stood at the door. He was looking directly at the house, knocking harder with each passing second. He seemed desperate, gesturing with one hand while the other continued pounding on the door. Part of me wanted to open it and ask what he wanted, but something about his behavior made me uneasy. His insistence was disturbing, as if there was more to this than just a plea for help. Instinct told me not to trust him, not to open the door. I didn't know who he was, and the fear that he might be dangerous began to grow inside me. I decided I wouldn't open the door. Maybe if he realized no one was going to answer, he would give up and leave. I went back to bed, trying to ignore the knocks that now echoed through the house. I closed my eyes, trying to find sleep again, but it was impossible. Each knock seemed louder, more insistent, as if he knew I was there, listening. The fear was turning into panic, and the thought of being alone in the house with that man outside paralyzed me. Time passed slowly, and the knocking continued. With each passing minute, my hope that he would leave dwindled. Finally, I decided to do something and shouted through the door, my voice trembling with fear. "Go away. I can't help you." For a moment, the knocking stopped, and I heard his voice on the other side, hoarse and desperate. "Please, I just need a place to shelter. You're not going to leave me out here, are you?" The anguish in his voice only heightened my panic. I knew I had to stand my ground. "Go away. I'm not opening the door," I shouted again, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But deep down, I knew this was far from over. The knocking resumed, and the fear that he wouldn't give up kept me in a state of constant alert. The knocking at the door finally stopped, but it didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. Instead, a sense of dread washed over me. The sudden silence was even more frightening than the persistent sound from before. I didn't know what he was doing, but I knew he was still out there. My mind raced with scenarios of what could happen next, and none of them were comforting. Suddenly, I heard footsteps around the house. He was circling, trying to find another way in. Every noise outside made my heart skip a beat. I ran to the kitchen where the back door was and locked it, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind was racing, and panic was taking over every part of me. I needed to lock all the entrances before he tried to get in through one of them. I went from room to room, locking windows and doors, trying to remember all the possible entry points. Every sound I heard outside made me imagine the worst. The fear that he might get in before I finished locking everything was overwhelming. I didn't know what he wanted, but his determination to get into my house suggested it wasn't anything good. I felt like I was racing against time. Finally, after locking everything I could remember, I returned to the living room and hid behind the couch. I could hear his footsteps outside, moving from one window to another, trying to find a way in. Panic consumed me, and I knew there wasn't much more I could do. Every noise outside seemed closer, more threatening. The fear that he was about to get in was suffocating. As I crouched there, hidden, a new wave of panic hit me. What if I had forgotten a window, a door? The house was old and had many nooks and internal doors. No matter how much I tried to remember them all, the fear that he might find a way in left me in complete despair. All I could do now was wait and pray that he would give up before it was too late. The tension inside the house was palpable. I was hidden behind the couch, trying to make as little noise as possible while listening to the man's footsteps circling outside. Then, as if the fear wasn't enough, all the lights in the house went out. Darkness engulfed the room, plunging me into total blackness. An oppressive silence followed the blackout, broken only by the sound of rain outside and the pounding of my heart. My first reaction was shock, followed by even deeper panic. Without light, my vulnerability seemed to increase exponentially. The darkness made it impossible to see what was happening outside and left me completely at the mercy of the unknown. In desperation, I tried to call someone, but the farm's signal, already weak, was completely out. And without power, the house's internet was also down. I knew I was in grave danger, and the fear that he would get in while I was in the dark was paralyzing. I needed to move, but the terror of making any sound kept me frozen. In total darkness, my mind began to imagine increasingly frightening scenarios. He could be forcing a window open right now, or maybe he was already inside the house, silently moving through the hallways, searching for me. I needed to stay calm, but the feeling of being surrounded by danger was unbearable. I was alone, in the dark, not knowing where he was or what he intended to do. Despite the fear, I knew I had to react. I grabbed my phone that was beside me and turned on the flashlight, which provided just a small beam of light. With it, I tried to illuminate as much as I could around me, but the house felt like a maze of shadows. Every move I made felt risky, as if he could appear at any moment. The phone's flashlight was my only defense against the oppressive darkness surrounding me. I decided the best thing to do would be to find a safer hiding place. The basement of the house was the best option, though the place also scared me. It was dark and claustrophobic, but it was also the hardest place to find. I knew that if I could make it there, I might have a chance to protect myself. However, every step I took toward the basement was accompanied by the fear that he was nearby, ready to catch me off guard. As I tried to reach the basement, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Not from outside, but from inside the house. He had gotten in. The fear I had felt earlier was nothing compared to the terror that now consumed me. Every sound he made, every movement seemed amplified by the darkness and silence that reigned around me. I could hear his footsteps echoing through the hallways, as if he knew exactly where he was going. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like he could hear it. I knew I had to keep moving, but the terror was paralyzing. The idea that he was inside the house, so close to me, left me in utter despair. I didn't know what he wanted, but the sense of danger was undeniable. I was in a desperate situation, and the fear that he would find me was almost unbearable. Determined not to be an easy target, I started moving again, though each step I took was slow and cautious. The phone's flashlight provided a small light that I used to guide my movements, but the darkness around me seemed alive, as if it hid all sorts of dangers. With every new sound he made, I shrank back, trying not to make any noise, hoping he wouldn't notice me. The sound of footsteps was getting closer, and I knew he was drawing nearer. My thoughts raced, trying to find a solution, a way to escape. The only option was to keep moving toward the basement. I knew it was the only place where I could hide with some chance of not being found. But the distance to it seemed endless, and the fear of being discovered grew with every second. Finally, I reached the basement entrance and went down the stairs as quietly as possible. The place was cold, damp, and dark, but at that moment, all that mattered was that I was out of his sight. I closed the basement door behind me, trying not to make any noise, and hid in the farthest corner I could find. I was completely alone, surrounded by darkness and silence, while he continued searching the house. All I could do now was wait and pray he wouldn't find me. In the basement, the darkness was total. The air was heavy and damp, filled with the smell of mold and earth. The phone's flashlight provided just a small circle of light, but it was enough to guide me to a hidden corner, where I crouched, trying to control my breathing. The sound of his footsteps above me was now the only indication of where he was. Every move he made seemed calculated, as if he was deliberately searching every room for something, or someone. I knew that if he found the basement, my chances of escaping would be minimal. The thought of him finding the door and coming down the stairs, finding me there, defenseless, was terrifying. But I couldn't think about that now. I had to stay focused and remain as quiet as possible. I listened to every creak of the wood, every groan of the floor, imagining how close he was. My heart was beating so fast it seemed to echo in the basement, and I desperately tried to control my breathing to not make any sound. As I listened to him moving above me, my entire body was tense, as if ready to run at any moment. The basement was the only place where I could hide, but it was also a trap if he found my location. With every sound he made, I shrank further into the corner, hoping he wouldn't find me. The fear that he would discover the basement was overwhelming, and I knew everything depended on him not realizing there was one more place to search. Time seemed to pass slowly, each second stretched by the fear I felt. The darkness around me became more oppressive, and the silence between his footsteps was almost unbearable. I knew he was somewhere above me, but I couldn't determine exactly where. Every moment that passed increased my panic, and I wondered how much longer I could endure that terror before succumbing to despair. Then he began to speak, his voice laden with tension. "Where are you hiding? I know you're alone," he asked, trying to provoke me. "Come out. I just want to talk." I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. When I didn't respond, he started breaking things, the sound of objects falling and glass shattering echoing through the house. "I'm going to find you," he shouted, the anger in his voice growing. "You can't deny help to someone who's without shelter. I'm going to teach you some manners." Panic took hold of me again, and the hope that he wouldn't find the basement seemed increasingly fragile. I knew all I could do was stay hidden and hope that the night would end, that my family would return, and that this nightmare would finally be over. With the intruder out of control, breaking various objects throughout the house and shouting for me, I heard a sound that brought immediate relief. The sound of my family's car approaching. The sound of tires on the gravel road was unmistakable, and my heart leapt with hope. They were coming home. But along with the relief came new panic. The man was still inside the house, and I needed to warn my family before it was too late. He couldn't come face to face with them unawares. With my heart racing, I left my hiding place in the basement, trying to make as little noise as possible. I knew I had to get to the front door before my family entered the house. The phone's flashlight barely lit the way, but I moved as quickly as I could, fighting against the fear that still gripped me. Every sound, every creak in the wooden floor, made me hold my breath, fearing that he might hear me and discover where I was. I reached the basement door and carefully opened it, praying that he wasn't nearby. The silence was oppressive, but I knew I had to keep going. I opened the door slowly, staying as quiet as I could. As soon as I opened the basement door, I heard the front door being opened. My family was coming in, unaware of the danger that awaited them. Panic surged within me, and I knew I didn't have any more time. I needed to act, and fast. I ran toward the living room, where I saw my family entering. I screamed as loud as I could, warning them about the intruder. The sound of my voice seemed to echo through the house, and I feared it was too late. The man, realizing he had been discovered, ran out, fleeing through the back door. I only saw a shadow disappearing into the darkness of the fields, and relief mixed with the residual fear that he might return. My family rushed to me, hugging me tightly, trying to calm me down. I was still in shock, trembling, unable to believe what had happened. The nightmare was finally over, but the emotions were still raw. The relief of seeing them safe was immense, but the fear of what could have happened, of what almost happened, still hung over me. I knew that night would be etched in my memory forever. With the man gone, my family did their best to comfort me and understand what had happened. The farm's security, which had always been a certainty, now felt fragile. My mind was in turmoil, trying to process the sequence of events. Who was that man? Why was he so determined to get into the house? And what would he have done if he had managed to find me? These questions began to swirl incessantly in my mind, without finding answers. My father and brother searched the farm, but found no sign of the intruder. It was as if he had disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the trail of terror he had caused. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. The farm, which had always been a place of peace and security, now felt like a place of danger, where anything could happen. I knew that the feeling of safety I had always had there had been irreparably shaken. My name is Clara, and I recently inherited an isolated farm from a distant relative, someone I had little contact with throughout my life. The farm, located in a remote area surrounded by vast fields and dense forests, seemed like the perfect opportunity to escape the stress of the city and find some peace. I decided to spend a few days there, organizing and tidying up the place, perhaps turning it into a retreat. When I arrived, everything seemed peaceful. But little did I know that my first night there would mark the beginning of something that would change my life forever. The main house was old but sturdy, made of wood and stone, with a welcoming appearance, though slightly weathered by time. The barn, located a short distance from the house, seemed to have been neglected for years. The paint was peeling, and the structure, though still standing, emitted an air of abandonment. I spent the first day cleaning and organizing the house, trying to breathe new life into the place. The sense of isolation was comforting at times, but at other moments it left me with a slight unease, as if something was out of place. At the end of the day, I felt exhausted but satisfied with the work I had done. I sat on the porch of the house, admiring the landscape around me as the sun set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The calm of the countryside was exactly what I needed to recharge. However, as I looked at the barn in the distance, I felt a slight shiver run down my spine. There was no reason to be worried, but the dark, looming structure seemed to hold secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. I decided to ignore that feeling and went inside, where I prepared a simple dinner and settled into the living room to relax. Night fell quickly, bringing with it complete darkness, something I wasn't used to experiencing in the city. With the curtains drawn and the lights off, the house became a cocoon of safety, shielding me from the outside world. Yet a part of me was still caught in that uneasy feeling, as if I somehow knew the tranquility I sought was about to be disrupted by something I couldn't foresee. Finally, I got ready for bed, feeling a bit more at ease. The bed was comfortable, and the day's accumulated fatigue began to weigh on me. I closed my eyes, trying to let sleep take over, but one last image of the barn crossed my mind, and with it, a dark premonition. Little did I know that this night would be the first of many that would make me question whether inheriting that farm was a blessing or a curse. That same night, I was awakened by a faint sense of discomfort, as if something was calling me from outside. I slowly opened my eyes, not sure what had woken me. The room was immersed in darkness, and the silence was absolute. I decided it was probably just the anxiety of having the responsibility of caring for this farm, something entirely new to me. But as I got up to go to the bathroom, something strange caught my attention. A faint, yellowish light was coming from outside, softly illuminating the curtains in my room. My heart raced, and I got up, driven by curiosity and a twinge of fear. I walked towards the window and opened the curtains, trying to understand where the light was coming from. That's when I saw it. The light was on inside the barn, which should have been completely empty. The dim glow lit up the old planks and wooden beams, casting strange and distorted shadows that seemed to dance within. For a moment I was paralyzed, unsure of what to think. Who could have turned on that light, and why? The farm was isolated, and I was certain I was alone there. Fear began to mix with a sense of curiosity and caution. I decided I needed to check out what was happening, but the idea of leaving the safety of the house in the middle of the night terrified me. However, I knew I wouldn't be able to go back to sleep without finding out what was causing that light. I grabbed a flashlight and a coat, preparing to face the cold of the night. I walked towards the barn, feeling each step echo in the silence of the farm. The cold wind cut through my skin, and the sound of dry leaves being dragged across the ground made me shiver. When I finally reached the barn door, I paused for a moment, trying to muster the courage to go in. The light was still on, faint but steady, and the fear of the unknown made my heart beat faster. I opened the barn door slowly, and the smell of damp hay filled my nostrils. The interior was empty, as I had expected, but the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. The light, which came from an old lamp hanging from the ceiling, flickered for a moment before going out completely, plunging the barn into deep darkness. I was alone, or at least it seemed that way. I decided it was better to return to the house, but the feeling of unease stayed with me throughout the night, preventing me from truly resting. The next night arrived wrapped in a dense atmosphere, as if the farm was waiting for something. I tried to stay busy during the day, organizing the house and avoiding thinking about what had happened the night before, but the memory of the light in the barn haunted me constantly. When the sun began to set, a sense of apprehension took hold of me. I knew the night would bring back the mystery surrounding the barn, and despite the fear, a part of me wanted to uncover the truth. As soon as darkness enveloped the farm, the light in the barn came on again. This time, curiosity mixed with an even greater dose of fear. I decided I couldn't ignore it. I needed to investigate again. I grabbed the flashlight and, with a heavy heart, walked towards the barn. As I approached, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. Muffled whispers coming from inside. The words were indistinct, but the tone was low and urgent, as if someone was talking to themselves or conspiring. I stopped, trying to understand what was happening. The whispers continued for a moment before abruptly stopping, as if they had sensed my presence. With my heart racing, I shouted, "Who's there?" But no one answered. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, as if the barn itself was holding its breath. Fear began to turn into panic, but I decided I couldn't back down now. I pushed the barn door open with the flashlight in one hand, ready to face whatever it was. As I entered, the dim light illuminated only part of the barn, leaving the rest submerged in shadows. I noticed the tools were out of place, some scattered on the floor as if someone had been moving them around recently. Footprints in the dust on the floor indicated that someone had been there, walking through the barn. The tracks were fresh, and the fact that I hadn't seen anyone during the day only heightened my terror. Who could be doing this? And why? My instincts told me to run out and lock the barn behind me, but something made me stay a little longer, trying to find some clue about what was happening. However, the feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to feel claustrophobic in that space. I decided it was time to head back to the house and try to figure out what was going on in a safer way. I quickly left the barn, locking the door behind me, but the mystery was far from solved, and the fear that something more sinister was to come continued to grow. Frightened by the events of the previous nights, I decided I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. That morning, I took chains and padlocks I had found in the shed and prepared to lock the barn for good. As I did so, I tried to rationalize the events, telling myself it might just be a lost traveler or an animal seeking shelter there. However, the fear and the feeling that something was very wrong wouldn't leave me alone. I spent much of the day securing the barn's doors and windows, making sure no one could get in or out. I used the chains to seal the doors in a way that made them look impenetrable. When I finished, I felt a bit more secure, as if I was regaining control of the situation. The idea was that with the barn locked, the mysterious light wouldn't turn on again, and the mystery would end there. However, a part of me was still apprehensive, waiting to see what the night would bring. When night fell, I braced myself for another tense evening. The sky was overcast, with no stars or moon to illuminate the farm, and the darkness seemed thicker than ever. I stayed by the window, watching the barn in the distance, hoping the locks had solved the problem. But to my horror, the light turned on again, as if the chains and padlocks weren't even there. My heart raced, and I felt panic taking over me. I ran to the door, ready to go out and check what was happening, but the thought of facing the unknown alone paralyzed me. I knew something was very wrong, but I couldn't understand what it could be. The light in the barn shone relentlessly, mocking my efforts to keep the place locked. The fear that something or someone was playing with me, manipulating my senses, was almost unbearable. I retreated inside, determined not to go out again that night. I closed all the curtains and locked the house as best I could, trying to create a barrier between me and the barn. However, I knew the problem wouldn't disappear on its own. Every night, the situation seemed to worsen, and the feeling that something evil was behind all of this haunted me. I didn't know how much longer I could endure the tension, but I was determined to find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The next morning, I woke up with a firm resolve to end this mystery once and for all. Spending another night of terror without knowing what was happening was not an option. I needed to confront my fears and find out who or what was turning on the light in the barn every night. I decided that tonight, I would hide inside and wait to see what happened. The idea terrified me, but my need for answers was stronger than my fear. I spent the day mentally preparing for what was to come. I grabbed a stronger flashlight, a piece of wood I found in the shed, and armed myself with courage. The plan was simple. As soon as night fell, I would sneak into the barn and hide somewhere I could see what was happening without being seen. The thought of spending the night there, alone, made me shiver, but I knew I couldn't back out now. As the sun began to set, I felt the fear returning, but I forced myself to stick to the plan. I waited until darkness completely enveloped the farm, and then, with the flashlight in hand, I headed towards the barn. The silence was oppressive, and each step seemed to echo louder than normal. When I reached the barn, I used the flashlight to illuminate the interior, and chose a dark corner to hide, behind a pile of hay that had been there, gathering dust for years. I sat on the floor, with my back against the wooden wall, and took a deep breath. The silence inside the barn was absolute, and the darkness around me seemed to swallow everything. I waited, my heart pounding, every sound amplified by the tension that enveloped me. Time passed slowly, and I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake by deciding to stay. But at the same time, I knew I needed to face this to move forward. Then, in the middle of the night, the light came on again, and my heart nearly stopped. I was so close this time that the light illuminated the area around me, and I could hear soft footsteps on the hay, as if someone was moving carefully. I held my breath, waiting to see what would happen next, and soon realized that the moment I had dreaded had arrived. I was finally about to discover what was behind the mystery of the barn. The sound of soft footsteps on the hay was more frightening than anything I had experienced so far. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he could hear it. I remained hidden, barely breathing, waiting to see what would happen next. The faint light from the ceiling illuminated part of the barn, and from where I was, I could see a figure emerging from the shadows. A man, dressed in old, worn clothes, holding an old pitchfork. He moved around the barn with a familiarity that made me realize he must have been living there for some time. Every step he took seemed calculated, and the low whisper of his voice was almost inaudible, as if he was talking to himself or something I couldn't see. Watching him rummage through the tools, as if it were routine, made my stomach turn. His presence there was unsettling, and the fear of being discovered grew with every second. For a moment, I considered the possibility of trying to talk to him, but the way he behaved, almost as if he was in a state of madness, made me abandon that idea. He moved with an unsettling slowness, inspecting every corner of the barn, unaware that I was hiding there. With each passing second, the sense of danger intensified. He was clearly comfortable in that space, as if it were his secret home, and I was the intruder. Finally, he stopped in the middle of the barn, still holding the pitchfork, and stood there, motionless, looking around as if he sensed something was wrong. The faint light from the ceiling cast sinister shadows on his face, and the fear I felt at that moment was overwhelming. I knew I needed to get out of there before he found me. The mere thought of being discovered by that man filled me with dread. It was time to act, and I knew I couldn't hesitate. I decided to leave my hiding place as quietly as possible. I kept my eyes on him, making sure he wouldn't notice me as I moved toward the door. The fear was so intense that my legs felt like rubber, but I managed to reach the door without being seen. With my heart in my throat, I slowly pushed the door open, trying not to make any noise. However, as soon as the door creaked, the man turned directly towards me. I let out a scream of despair when I saw his eyes locked on me, and then I ran out of the barn. My only thought was to escape from that place. As soon as I stepped out of the barn, the cool night air hit me hard, but it didn't bring relief. The fear of being caught by the man drove me to run as fast as I could towards the house. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the silence of the night, and behind me, I heard the barn door slam open violently. He had realized my escape. Panic took hold of me, and I knew I needed to reach the house before he caught up to me. Every step felt heavier than the last, but the adrenaline kept me moving. I glanced back for a brief moment and saw him running after me, holding the pitchfork like a weapon. The glow from the barn's light behind him made his silhouette even more terrifying. I knew I couldn't stop, that my life depended on reaching the safety of the house. The uneven terrain of the farm made the run difficult, but I refused to slow down. Finally, I reached the house door and pushed it open, quickly locking it behind me. I could hear my heavy breathing and the sound of his footsteps approaching. I knew he was outside trying to find a way in, but at least I had managed to buy some time. I ran to grab the phone, and with trembling hands, I called the police. My voice was shaking with fear as I described what had happened and begged for help. As I waited for the police to arrive, every second felt like an eternity. I didn't know if he was trying to break down the door, or if he was circling the house, looking for another way in. The darkness outside seemed more oppressive than ever, and the feeling of being surrounded by danger was overwhelming. I locked all the windows and hid in the living room, trying to stay alert for any sign that he was trying to get in. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I heard the distant sound of police sirens. The relief I felt was immediate, but the fear was still there, like a shadow that refused to disappear. I stayed hidden until I heard the voices of the officers outside. I ran to the door and unlocked it, feeling a huge weight lifted off my shoulders as I saw the officers approaching the house. I was safe, at least for now, but I knew the nightmare wasn't over yet. The police entered the house, and I quickly explained what had happened. They listened carefully, and then, armed with flashlights, they began searching for the man in the barn and around the property. I waited in the house, trembling with fear and exhaustion, unable to shake the image of the man with the pitchfork running after me. Minutes passed, and the officers returned, their expressions serious. The man had disappeared. All that was left were the signs that he had been there for a long time. The officers found old, worn clothes, remnants of food, and tracks in the dust that indicated someone had been using the barn as a dwelling. However, there was no sign of the man. He had vanished into the darkness of the night, leaving only the mystery of his presence and the terror he had caused. Although I was relieved to be safe, the thought that he might be hiding somewhere nearby, waiting to return, left me deeply disturbed. Finally, after checking all possible areas and ensuring the house was secure, the police left, leaving me alone again. The darkness still surrounded the farm, but now it felt much more threatening than before. The house was silent, but the fear I felt continued to grow, fueled by the doubts and unanswered questions. Who was that man, and why was he living there? hidden in the barn. My name is Jake, and that night, I was alone on my family's farm. Ever since I was a child, I've always enjoyed the solitude of the countryside, the silence that the night brings, broken only by the soft sound of the wind passing through the cornfields. The farm was located far from any big city, surrounded by acres of cultivated land that seemed to stretch out to the horizon. Being alone there never bothered me. In fact, I cherished the peace and quiet that isolation offered. That night, everything seemed normal, just like so many others I had spent there. After a long day of work, I got ready for bed. Fatigue had built up, and the thought of resting in my comfortable bed was comforting. The night was particularly calm, and there was nothing to suggest that something out of the ordinary was about to happen. The rhythmic sound of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves lulled me, and the darkness around the farm brought a sense of security. I lay down in bed, expecting a peaceful night's sleep. As I closed my eyes, I realized how profound the silence of the farm was. It was the kind of silence you only find in remote places, where city lights don't reach and the sounds of traffic are non-existent. It was a silence so thick that any noise, no matter how small, could be heard clearly. But that night, there was nothing. Just the absolute silence that enveloped me like a warm blanket, making me sink even deeper into sleep. However, there was something in the air that I couldn't quite identify. A feeling of unease that I couldn't explain, as if the silence was waiting to be abruptly shattered. I tried to brush off this feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me because of exhaustion. But even so, a small part of me couldn't shake the impression that something was about to happen. Something that would completely change the course of that night. With my body heavy with sleep and my eyes closed, it didn't take long for me to start drifting off. But little did I know that the tranquility of that night was about to be broken in a way I could never have imagined, and that the peace I so appreciated on the farm would soon turn into a terror I would never forget. I woke up suddenly, not sure what had pulled me from my sleep. At first, I lay there trying to understand what was happening. Then I heard it again. Distant screams, coming from the cornfields surrounding the house. They were desperate screams, as if someone was in great danger or experiencing unimaginable pain. My heart started to race as I got out of bed, still half dazed from the interrupted sleep. I ran to the window, trying to see something in the darkness outside, but I couldn't see anything beyond the vastness of the cornfields. The screams continued, and I couldn't just ignore them. I grabbed a flashlight and quickly put on my boots, preparing to go out and investigate. It didn't make sense for someone to be out there at that hour, but the possibility that someone might need help pushed me to leave the house, even as fear began to form at the back of my mind. I stepped out the front door, and the cold night air immediately surrounded me. The flashlight in my hand seemed weak against the darkness that engulfed me. Each step I took towards the field felt heavy, and the screams grew louder as I got closer. The thought of finding someone injured or in danger drove me forward, but the fear that something was terribly wrong kept me on high alert. As I walked through the cornfields, the screams began to change. From sounds of desperation, they started to mix with something that sounded like a lament, as if the night itself was crying. The atmosphere around me grew increasingly dense, as if the air was being sucked out, leaving only a sense of oppression. I knew something wasn't right, but I kept moving forward, guided by the flashlight and the need to discover the source of those screams. Finally, I reached the middle of the field. The screams abruptly stopped, leaving me in an eerie silence. I stood there, panting, looking around, but all I could see were endless rows of corn. The contrast between the earlier screams and the now absolute silence was disturbing. The feeling that something was deeply wrong completely enveloped me, and for the first time, I thought that maybe leaving the house to investigate had been a mistake. The silence that followed the screams was so sudden that it left me even more on edge. The field, which had previously seemed alive with anguished sounds, was now completely quiet. The flashlight in my hand illuminated only small patches of the path ahead, leaving most of the field submerged in darkness. Every rustle of corn leaves in the night breeze seemed louder than normal, heightening the tension I felt. I tried calling out for someone, but my voice came out lower than I had intended. "Is anyone there?" I asked, but my voice seemed to get lost in the vastness of the field. The silence responded, dense and oppressive, as if the field itself was holding its breath. The air around me felt colder, and the sensation of being watched began to grow inside me. The flashlight, which had previously seemed like protection, now felt insufficient to fend off the darkness surrounding me. As I ventured deeper into the field, I began to feel the weight of isolation. Every step I took seemed to lead me further into a never-ending maze. There was nothing but tall plants around me, and the way back seemed to become harder to find with each passing second. The fear of being lost began to mix with the growing feeling that I wasn't alone. I knew I had to keep going, but what I might find next filled me with an apprehension that was hard to ignore. Suddenly, a gust of wind swept through the field, rustling the cornstalks around me. The sound of the leaves moving made me pause for a moment, but when everything calmed down again, the silence returned, even heavier than before. Whatever had been causing those screams seemed to have disappeared, but the sense of impending danger remained. Something was very wrong, and with each passing second, that certainty solidified in my mind. I was in the middle of the field, surrounded by a darkness that felt alive, and the silence was deafening. Something was about to happen, something I couldn't predict. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the feeling of being watched was growing stronger. Panic was beginning to set in, but I knew I had to keep going. I had to find out what was happening. And that's when I saw the footprints. The footprints on the ground immediately caught my attention. The flashlight illuminated the uneven ground, where fresh tracks were clearly visible in the soft earth. However, something was wrong. The footprints seemed to appear out of nowhere, starting in the middle of the field, with no clear point of origin. It didn't make sense. Whoever had left those marks didn't seem to have come from anywhere specific, as if they had simply materialized there. I approached, crouching down to examine the footprints more closely. They were human, no doubt, but something about them made me uneasy. They were large and deep, indicating that the person who left them was in a hurry or carrying a considerable weight. However, what disturbed me the most was the fact that, just as they started from nowhere, the footprints also ended abruptly. There was no continuity, as if the person had simply vanished into thin air. I looked around, trying to understand how this was possible. The field was quiet, with no signs of movement. The fear I already felt began to intensify, turning into a kind of controlled panic. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. It was as if I was in a nightmare, where the rules of the real world didn't apply. The feeling of being lost, both physically and mentally, overwhelmed me. As I crouched there trying to make sense of the footprints, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if these weren't the only footprints? What if there were more signs that something or someone was surrounding me? I stood up quickly, sweeping the field with the flashlight, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light, leaving most of the field hidden. The idea that something was watching me, hidden among the rows of corn, sent a shiver down my spine. And then suddenly, I heard it. A whisper, very close to my ear, soft, almost inaudible but clearly real. I froze, feeling fear take hold of me. I quickly turned around, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing. Just the field, the corn swaying gently in the wind, and the absolute silence. However, I knew I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I knew something was about to happen. The whisper still echoed in my mind as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Fear mixed with confusion, creating a sense of panic that I struggled to keep under control. I was surrounded by darkness, and the flashlight in my hand seemed less useful with each passing second. I tried to convince myself that the whisper was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Something was out there. Something I couldn't see, but could definitely feel. I kept looking around, trying to find any sign of what had whispered in my ear. That's when, at the edge of the flashlight's beam, I saw a silhouette. It was standing still, unmoving, among the rows of corn, at a distance I couldn't precisely determine. The figure was indistinct, like a solid shadow. but there was something terribly wrong about it. It seemed to be watching me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. The mere sight of that dark form made the panic inside me grow. For a moment I was paralyzed, unable to move or think about anything other than that silhouette. Whatever it was watching my every move, and I knew I had to act. The fear was almost suffocating, and every instinct inside me screamed to run. But before I could do anything, the silhouette began to move. Slowly it started advancing towards me, crossing the cornfield like a shadow unfolding in the darkness. As the figure approached, the screams that had previously stopped resumed, louder and more disturbing than before. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me, as if the night itself was screaming. The sound was so intense that my ears buzzed, and the fear I had felt earlier turned into pure terror. The figure kept advancing, getting closer and closer, and I knew I couldn't just stand there. I decided I had to run. I had to get out of there before it was too late. With my heart pounding uncontrollably, I turned around and started running back through the field, leaving behind the footprints, the whisper, and the dark figure. The screams echoed around me, and the feeling of being chased was unbearable. I didn't know what was happening, but the only thing that mattered was getting out of there as quickly as possible, before something terrible happened. The run back through the field felt endless. Each step I took seemed to take me deeper into a maze with no exit, and the darkness around me closed in, making it difficult to see the way back to the house. The screams continued, growing louder, as if they were coming from inside my own head. The figure I had seen before was etched in my mind, and the thought that it was still chasing me made my heart race even faster. I could feel the presence of the figure behind me, even without looking back. It was as if the air around me was heavy with its presence, and the fear that it might catch up to me pushed me to run faster. However, the uneven terrain and the darkness made my escape difficult, and I stumbled frequently, nearly falling several times. Each time I lost my balance, the panic increased because I knew I couldn't stop, not even for a second. As I ran, the sound of the screams seemed to intensify, echoing in my ears in a way that was almost deafening. It was as if the field itself was alive, screaming in despair. The flashlight in my hand trembled, and the beam of light wavered, making it even harder to navigate the narrow path between the rows of corn. The feeling of being hunted, of being prey on the run, was unbearable, and the fear that something terrible was about to happen consumed all my thoughts, leaving only the desperate need to escape. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the house in the distance. The sight of the house, with its light still on, gave me a new surge of energy. I was almost there, almost safe. I kept running, ignoring the pain in my legs and the exhaustion that was starting to set in. The screams still surrounded me, but now there was a renewed hope that I could escape, that I could reach the safety of the house before it was too late. With the last few meters of strength I had left, I ran towards the house's door, throwing it open and rushing inside. I quickly locked the door behind me, my trembling hands barely able to turn the key in the lock. The sound of the screams outside continued, but now, with the door locked between me and the field, I felt a little safer. The terror was still there, but the fact that I had reached the house gave me a brief sense of relief, even though I knew the nightmare wasn't over yet. I ran to all the windows, making sure they were securely closed and locked. The feeling that something was about to invade the house was overwhelming, and fear made me act quickly. Every second felt like a race against time, as if the dark figure that had chased me through the field was getting closer, trying to find a way in. As I rushed from room to room, my mind struggled to process what was happening. Nothing made sense. Who was that figure? Where had those screams come from? The farm, which had always been a refuge of peace and tranquility, now seemed like a scene from a horror movie. Panic mixed with exhaustion, and I felt that at any moment, something would break through the walls of the house and find me, leaving me with no escape. After checking all the entrances, I hid in the living room trying to catch my breath. The sound of the screams still echoed outside, but somehow inside the house they seemed distant, as if the building was shielding me from their full impact. The flashlight I was still holding trembled in my hand, and I was drenched in sweat, despite the cold night air. The terror of the chase was still present, pulsing in my mind like a drumbeat. As I sat there hiding, Waiting for the worst, I realized that the screams were beginning to fade. First slowly, as if they were moving away, and then more quickly, until suddenly, they stopped completely. The silence that followed was so sudden and absolute that it left me even more panicked. It was as if the field itself had decided it had caused enough fear and was now ready to leave me in peace. But I knew that silence didn't bring relief. I remained still, waiting for any sign that the danger had passed. Every second that passed without a sound felt like an eternity of uncertainty. Then, finally, I decided to move, cautiously peeking out the window to see if anything had changed. Outside, the field was quiet and still as if nothing had happened. But I knew that calm was deceptive. Something had changed that night, and the feeling that I still wasn't safe lingered, like a shadow that refused to disappear. When morning finally came, it felt like the previous night had been just a bad dream. The daylight brought a sense of normalcy, but I knew that nothing was normal. I could still feel the fear I had experienced, and the memories of the screams and the figure in the field were etched in my mind. I decided to leave the house and take a look around, hoping to find some evidence of what had happened, something that would explain the terrifying events of the night before. I walked through the cornfield, now bathed in sunlight, but everything seemed peaceful. There were no signs of the mysterious footprints, the screams, or the dark figure that had chased me. It was as if the previous night had been erased, left only in my memory as a lived nightmare. The silence that now filled the field was different from what I had felt at night. It was the usual morning silence, a silence that should have been comforting, but that left me suspicious. As I explored, I kept searching for anything out of the ordinary, but I found nothing. There were no signs that anyone had been there, no marks on the ground, nothing to indicate that the previous night had been real. However, I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. The feeling of being watched still followed me, as if the field had eyes I couldn't see, but that could see me clearly. The lack of answers was even more unsettling than the event itself. I returned to the house, feeling uneasy and exhausted. I felt like something had changed forever. The farm, which had always been a place of refuge and safety, now seemed like a place full of hidden mysteries and dangers. Even though the screams had stopped and the figure had disappeared, the sense that something was wrong remained. I knew I couldn't continue living there as I had before, without questioning what had happened. Every night that followed, the fear that the screams would return kept me awake, and the idea that the dark figure was still out there, waiting to reveal itself again, gave me no peace. What really happened that night? Who was the figure in the field? These questions never left me, and although the screams had disappeared, the impact of that night never faded from my memory. The farm to me would never be the same again.